Okay, here we are. This would be week 12 tonight, and we're going to have lectures 23 and 24. We will start with the Mongols East and West in the first half of tonight's lecture, and in the second half we will look at Japan. We have a lot of readings. I accidentally brought the textbook. We have a whole chapter in the textbook on Mongol and Eurasia, so that's really good. You have a lot of information in the textbook. I brought the Human Record, which has quite a bit to read on the Mongols. Let's see, Travel in the Age of the Pax Romana. We have readings on Chinggis Khan, and then some European readings on the Silk Road and some of the missionaries who went to the Mongol Empire in China. So I brought the wrong book. I meant to bring the Global Experience, and I didn't bring it. But anyway, at least I can call your attention to the readings on the Mongols in the Human Record. And again, we have a whole chapter on the Mongols in our textbook, chapter 11. All right, let's turn to the Mongols and see how they fit into world civilization. All right, the Mongols East and West. Last time, we actually did the Vikings East and West, and we looked at the spread of the Vikings all the way from the New World to Russia, emerging from, I guess you might call it, the center of our map there where Scandinavia is, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and the Vikings burst out upon the world, spreading their, I guess you would call it their culture of raiding and trading, and discovering from the New World all the way east to Russia, and carrying out state building and affecting Europe in a very strong way, changing the nature of the development of Europe. Then we talked about the Viking raids calming down, the Vikings converting to Christianity and integrating into Europe. It took a long time to integrate, but when peace broke out all over around the year 1000, we then have a series of revolutions taking place. I asked you last time, does anybody remember what those revolutions were? I was asking you before class started. Anybody remember what the revolutions were before we put them on the screen? Anybody remember one of the revolutions from last time that we talked about? Yeah.
There was the commercial, technological, urban, and agricultural, and social. I don't know if I said that already.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so you want to put our notes on the screen, Don? Okay, there was a whole series of revolutions around the year 1000. It began with the agricultural revolution and the heavy plow, and then we have other technological things like the watermill and the windmill for a technological revolution, which then stimulated the growth of trade and cities, and we have an economic revolution. I also included in that an urban revolution. And finally, we had a revolution that's political and social that some people call the Feudal Revolution, but not everybody. Yeah, question?
Is this by any chance the Axial Age?
The Axial Age.
The Axial Age?
What is the Axial Age? I'm sorry, I don't know what it is.
Something from 1800 when they had, the same kind of revolutions. I was just wondering if it's the same one.
Are you thinking of the Industrial Revolution?
It's called the Axial Revolution.
I don't know what that is. I'm sorry. Could you give me a reference to it and tell me, it happened in the 18th century?
800 ADs.
Press your mic.
800 ADs.
800 ADs? I have never heard of it before. Okay, sorry. Okay. Okay, if you can bring me some information on that, because I don't know what it is. Often, there's one book by Jean Gimpel that calls this whole series of revolutions the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages, and a revolution that is based on the watermill and the windmill, which he equates to the steam engine in the impact that it had on society and how it changed all society. So that was what we looked at last time, and we also looked at the formation, the responses to the Viking invasions, which we identified as the coming, as state building, the coming together of the Ottoman Empire, the defense against the Vikings in England, the Alfredian defense in England, and the creation of the English state, the creation of Russia, Poland, and Hungary as new state building that's going on. And in France, we had a breakdown of order and a new kind of order based on our Carolingian forms that is identified, or has been identified, as feudalism. And I'm sorry that medievalists, I'm hesitating on this because medievalists are arguing what feudalism is and if it really existed or not. I'm calling it feudalism because some people are still calling it feudalism. And it's a nice label that identifies the culture of the High Middle Ages, and so I like to use the term, but I want to point out to you that it's disputed. We had also looked at Tang China. Before we look at the Mongols, we have to go back and look at Tang China and where we left that development of China a few lectures back, a few weeks back. We talked about Tang China. Notice that Tang China is in two parts, in the area that we think of as China proper, and it's also in the middle of the Eurasian continent. And remember also that Tang China incorporated the nomadic culture of Central Asia, the Uyghur culture, the Turkish culture, the Khitan culture, that whole nomadic culture of Central Asia. Tibet was also incorporated, although it's kind of on the fringes here of Tang China as we see it in its development. And so we have a very diverse culture in Tang China, the blending together of Turkic, nomadic, Central Asian culture with classical Chinese culture. Okay, this is the Mongol homeland in that very area where we have the traditional nomads of Eurasia, the Turks, the Huns, the Mongols, the Uyghurs, all of those peoples coming from that region that I have labeled the Mongol homeland. And here on this map we can see Song China replacing Tang China. Tang China lost its control over the Central Asian part of the empire. If we go back to that, they lost control of that Central Asian part of their empire, and then a new dynasty took over, and it's Song China. And the main characteristic of Song China was that it returned, it rejected all of that Central Asian nomadic culture that had crept into China, and it returned to the core culture of China that had been growing since the beginning of China in a new and more exuberant way of fastening on that classical Chinese culture, rejecting outside influences. Okay, so the Mongols are developing side by side with Song China. All right, and here is Song China and the nomadic empires that surrounded it. Out of these nomadic empires, the Mongols suddenly arose very quickly and took them over. Here's Song China and the nomadic empires that surrounded it. The Lao Empire, Tibet, and the Chia Empire. Okay, this is the Mongol homeland again. In the pink around Lake Baikal, that's the region, the homeland, where the very first of the Mongols, Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan, was the leader who led the Mongols out to conquer most of the Eurasian continent. All right, the rise of the Mongols took place from 1215 to 1368. This is the time of the rise of the Mongols. They're nomads of Central Asia that made a stunning return to the center stage of Eurasia. This is the period that is the golden age of nomadic culture. Okay, in 1206, Temujin took the name of Genghis Khan and the Chinggis Khan or Genghis Khan, and the Mongol state was founded. Chinggis Khan, or Temujin, was very like Alexander the Great. He succeeded as a ruler as a teen, and he inherited his father's war machine. He was taken prisoner by a rival and enslaved, and in a daring midnight escape, he fled to the mountains and joined an ally of his father. Meanwhile, another rival raided his camp and stole his women and his horses, and he avenged them all and attracted numerous followers by his bravery. Okay, and here we see a Mongol camp. Here we see the Mongols as nomads. What are the characteristics of nomads? We've dealt with nomads, and you're going to have a question on the final exam about the nomads as an impact. What is the nomadic impact on world civilization? So what are the characteristics of the nomads? Remember, it's a technical term. It has specific meaning. We have to go all the way back to the very first nomads who impacted civilization. Remember, the Indo-Europeans were the first nomads who entered the civilized world of the Mesopotamian River Valley. Yes?
The nomads were horseback riders.
Yes.
And they also used archery.
Yes.
And they didn't attack their enemies in the same way. It wasn't an organized fashion. They were kind of chaotic, and they had extremely well-planned battle strategies.
But what makes them different from civilization? Okay, we talked about the Mesopotamian River Valley, and we talked about the civilization that was there, and the nomads are not part of civilization. And they're not here when we're looking at them in Central Asia either.
Well, they moved around.
Yeah, good. Yeah, yeah. Why did they move around?
Well, they wanted to invade other territories, for one, and they lived primarily on, well, I mean, they had animals, and they did some foraging and things like that, but they raided and plundered.
Yes.
I said that right. And that's how they gained their wealth. They needed it to survive because the civilizations had the wealth that they did not have.
Exactly. They tended to be poor. That's one thing about them. They herd animals rather than grow crops. So they're animal herders. That's why they move around, because they have to move around with their animals. Not necessarily because they want to conquer people. That comes later, but because they have to. Because if you herd animals, you have to move around from the summer pasture to the winter pasture. And so you move around, and that means you can't build cities, right? If you move around from one spot to another all the time, for every summer and every winter, you can't build cities. So they don't live in cities. But nomads have a tremendous impact on the rest of the world's civilization. We've already looked at the Indo-Europeans and their impact. Think for a minute about the Vikings. They're Indo-Europeans. They're a new kind of migrant people, I guess you can talk about them moving around in their ships. Okay, now the Mongols also move around from place to place, and they're invading new civilizations. And what is really surprising is how alike the Mongols are, how similar they are to the Indo-Europeans in the kind of culture that they have and in the traditions that they develop. And that makes you think all of a sudden, well, there's something about nomads that makes them develop a particular kind of civilization. There's something about their lifestyle. Now, as I describe this lifestyle to you, think about the Indo-Europeans and the similarities. Now, the Mongols are not Indo-Europeans. They're not of the same linguistic group. They're of a totally different group, but they're nomads. Okay, so nomads have similarities to each other. So let's look at the kind of culture they have. We'll go through for quite a long time about the culture. In the case of Genghis Khan, and I compared him to Alexander the Great, who was a Greek, who was also an Indo-European, right? Okay. As a young teenager, he started out and he gathered all his followers together. First, his camp was raided, his women and horses were stolen. He avenged them all and attracted numerous followers by his bravery, okay? Now, how is leadership attained in the Mongol nomadic culture? They hold a meeting, a Kurultai, which is a meeting of all the chieftains, And there they elected Temujin, who is better known as Chinggis Khan or Genghis Khan. They elected him supreme ruler. Okay, here we have another case of elective rulership in a nomadic culture. Chinggis Khan united the Mongol tribesmen and numerous nomadic neighbors and created the greatest war machine ever seen in history as a result. Okay, let's take a look here. The Kurultai is the meeting all the chief. He was elected Khan, elected by the Kurultai, and this is the way they elect their rulers. They elect their rulers again. He united the Mongol tribesmen. He conquered Central Asia, northern China, and eastern Persia. Okay. With this great war machine. Okay, how is it made up? It's made up of fighting units. Each one is called a Tumens, and the Tumens is a fighting unit of 10,000 cavalry. Now, the Tumens is further subdivided, first into units of 1,000, and those units of 1,000 are divided into units of 100, and those units of 100 are divided into units of 10. Okay, so they have a very complicated numerical breakdown of this basic group of 10,000 cavalry so that they can control their troops on a level as low as a group of 10 warriors. Now, they're also divided into heavy cavalry and light cavalry, and they do have cavalry. They ride horses. This is another thing that makes them like the Indo-Europeans. They ride horses and they fight on horseback. Yeah, question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what's the basic difference between heavy and light cavalry?
Thank you for that question. I'm not sure I can tell you. I believe that heavy cavalry is armored, and I'm thinking more about the Turks here, who are also related to the Mongols. They kind of get all mixed up in Central Asia. And the Turks also have a cavalry where they ride on horseback and shoot arrows, so that they can't wear heavy armor because they can't, have a force that shoots arrows. So I'll try to find more detail about that for you. Good question. Okay. All right, so they're divided into heavy cavalry and light cavalry. Chinggis Khan created a separate messenger force for communications because, as we're going to see on the map in a moment, the empire covered a vast territory, and so he had to have a network of messengers to go back and forth from one place to another, and also a network of spies and informers who supplied maps for the invasion. So, like the Persian Empire, if you recall, there's a network of spies who go around and then come back and report to Chinggis Khan. In the process of the growth of this great conquering army, new weapons were developed that included flaming and exploding arrows and gunpowder projectiles, which later developed into bronze cannons. And so new weapons were developed into this empire. Here is the Mongol Empire as it developed under Chinggis Khan. And you see it spreads through Central Asia all the way, touching the Middle East, touching China, touching Russia. But what he did was unify all of the Central Asian nomadic area where all the nomads are coming from. And then it progressively grew larger and larger and larger. This is Chinggis Khan's conquest. In 1215, we see the first Mongol attacks on North China. And at this point, Beijing was captured and Song China was driven southward. The Tang kingdom was forced to pay tribute and became a vassal of the Khan. Khan can be spelled with a G, which is silent, or Khan, as it is here. China becomes more and more focused at this point on Chinese culture, more ethnocentric and less syncretic, focusing much more closely on its own culture as reaction against these new nomadic invaders. Okay, and here we see China building walls around around the Song kingdom. This is an early Chinese wall. Later it will become what is called the Great Wall of China. But these are the first walls built against the barbarians, okay? And here we see the earlier empires that were actually conquered to the north of Song China, okay? In 1219 to 1223, we see the first Mongol invasions of Russia and the Islamic world. And so they're nibbling around the fringes. And about this point, in 1227, Chinggis Khan died. He was then succeeded by Ogadai and his son, Chinggis Khan's son. And Ogadai and all his brothers then united together, and they set out on great conquest. They conquered the rest of China. They conquered Tibet, Persia, Iraq, and most of Asia, and Asia Minor and southern Russia, okay? Then, once they had this huge area conquered, they couldn't control it, even with the institutions developed by Chinggis Khan. And so they divided it into 4 kingdoms, okay, 4 khanates. And here we have the map with the 4 khanates. The Golden Horde encompasses most of Russia and the area east of Russia. The Khanate of the Great Khan is the yellow here, and this is the area of China. The Emirate of, or the Khanate of Chagatai is in the center there in Central Asia, and the Khanate of Persia is in the area, in the region that is Persia, again, including part of the Muslim world. Okay. As we can see from this map, from 1235 to 1279, the Mongols conquered most of South China, or all of South China, eliminating completely the Song Dynasty. And the Song Dynasty was ended. The Mongols spared the lives of famed scholars and artisans whom they employed. It's interesting that these nomads were so sensitive to the accomplishments of civilization because they spared the artists and the craftsmen and the scholars, and then they hired them and used them in their government. The fortified towns that fought back were sacked and the inhabitants were slaughtered. The towns that surrendered were spared, but they were forced to pay tribute or tax, even if they surrendered. And so this is the beginning of the conquest. And here we see the regions that were conquered. We're looking at the conquest of China, which we'll come back to a little bit later. Look at the green part on this map. From 1236 to 1240, the Mongols conquered Russia. And at this point, you can see what a vast empire they have. Most of Asia, and they're moving into Europe when they conquer Russia. They're nibbling away at the borders of Europe. Now the Mongols had created a vast empire, and once hostile peoples now lived in peace. And one of the interesting things about the Mongol Empire is that they practiced complete religious toleration. Okay, from Eastern Europe to Southern China, merchants and travelers could move unmolested. Caravans and embassies transmitted new foods, inventions, and ideas, and the nomads were the intermediaries. Also, what they did was to create, and here we can look at our maps, what is called the Pax Mongolica. What other paxes have we had? Anybody remember any other paxes? These are not diseases, rather pax means peace, okay? What other paxes have we had? Yep.
You're talking about like pax, was it Rome? Romana?
Yes, yes, good. Okay, let me write that down, the Pax Romana. Any other paxes we've had? Anybody remember any others? We've had at least one other. Yeah.
The Pax Islamica?
Yes, the Pax Islamica. Okay. What do these paxes have in common? What do they have in common? If you think back about the Pax Romana, the Pax Islamica. Yeah?
Like peace, prosperity, religious toleration, that sort of thing.
Yes. It's a period of great peace. It takes place during an empire. We actually had another one. We had one during the first Chinese empire, the Pax Sinica, the first Chinese empire. It's a period when you have a great empire that controls a large territory, where there is peace and people and merchants can move from one end of it to another. You have great diversity within a large empire, and you have exchanges going on of different kinds of culture. Diversity in the empire and exchanges from one end of the empire to another. Economic prosperity, because people can move from one side to another. Merchants can trade from one end of it to another. And at least for the Roman Empire, at least one historian called it a golden age because of religious tolerance and because of great prosperity within the empire. So now we have the Pax Mongolica, where all of these diverse territories are unified together. The vast empire served as a bridge between cultures of East and West and as a world network tying everyone together. As I said, caravans and embassies transmitted new foods, inventions, and ideas across the trade routes that these nomads created. Okay. There was complete religious toleration from Eastern Europe to South Asia. I've just said all of this. Okay, let's skip to the next one. And here we have the empire again. The Mongols epitomized nomadic culture, and we've had nomads before. Here is a Mongol. We've had nomads before, the Indo-Europeans, and the Mongols are similar in very many ways. They herded. They epitomized nomadic culture. Okay, they herded. Their staple foods were meat and milk. They herded herds of goats and sheep that they drove from pasture to pasture. They gained veggies and grain through trade with agriculturalists. And here's one of the hut wagons of the Mongols, a reconstruction of it again, so that they move from place to place. And this is a kind of portable tent that they would take with them. It's made out of felt. As soon as they contacted Arabia and the Middle East, they had camels that were used in the middle of Asia as well. So this is a kurt, it's called, and it's the hut wagon of the Mongols. Here is the vast territories of Central Asia, just these vast expanses of land and pasture land and desert, and this is where their homeland was. Here you can see a caravan going across the sands. And here you can see a caravan resting in their journeys. Okay, the nomads were herders. Their staple foods were meat and milk, and they traded for veggies and grains. They also produced hides and dairy products, which they traded for jewelry and weapons and cloth. And they dressed in sheepskins, they had sheep hide boots, and they lived in round felt tents, which I've already shown you. They had tough little ponies that they used for war. And the children could ride as soon as they could walk, and these included the little girls. And this is another very interesting thing about nomadic culture. There's a tendency for women to have a lot more freedom in nomadic cultures, and this is very true of the Mongols as well. They play a kind of polo game on their ponies, and women could play it too. Women also learned to ride the ponies as soon as they could walk, as well as the boys. They had, and here we see some scenes from the Mongol life. This is a Mongol dog that they have. I think this is actually a wild Mongolian dog, which eats the dead and attacks the living, is what the caption says. And here is an antelope that they would hunt that lives on the desert plains. Here are some different kinds of tents, but here are some Mongols, modern day. These are 19th Mongols dressed in their native costumes from that time. They practiced a shamanistic religion that practices the propitiation of nature spirits. They didn't really have a concept of the gods, but thought of the world as ruled by spirits embodied in nature, and this could be fire, this could be wind, this could be a bush, this could be a mountain, anything of that type. It is a shamanistic religion, so they don't really have a concept of the gods, and this makes them very vulnerable to the higher religions such as Christianity and Islam and the Chinese, not so much the Chinese religion, but Christianity and Islam. Here are some modern Mongols, and actually they're investigating flashlights, which they think are really fascinating. This is 19th century again, but here you can see some Mongols. Here is a Mongol musician with the kind of stringed instruments that they habitually played. And here is wrestling and sports, and again I mentioned polo that they played on horseback that women could be involved in too. Here is the desert with a caravan going across the desert. This is their native region. And here they are making felt, felt is wool from animals, and it's pressed together, usually wet, to make a heavy, thick fabric that's very good at insulating. And so this is what they make their tents out of. Here they're modern Mongols making felt. And here's a Mongol maiden who's very beautiful in her elaborate headdress. Okay, as I said, they had a shamanistic religion which involves spirits in natural objects of various kinds. Remember that a shaman is a kind of priest who rises at the moment of need. He's a regular member of the tribe, and he comes forward when he's needed to perform religious ceremonies and then joins back in the tribe when he's finished. The basic political unit is the tribe, and the tribe was divided into kin-related clans. And these kin-related clans would camp and herd together. In danger, though, they could all get together and combine into a great federation, just as we saw happening under Chinggis Khan when he pulled all the nomadic Mongols of Central Asia together. And like Chinggis Khan, they elected their leaders by a group of all the free males, so that they had elected leaders, but women had the right to be heard in the council as well. They couldn't vote in the election, but they could be heard in the council. How did they choose their leaders? On what basis did they choose them? They chose them for their courage in battle and their ability to form alliances between various groups and unify them, and that made them leaders. And if they could attract dependents or followers to follow them. When they had rivals, their defeated rivals were often enslaved. So the leaders were jealous of their power. The Mongols, interestingly, proved remarkably astute and tolerant rulers of their captured peoples. They didn't impose their culture, and here we see the Mongol Empire stretching from one side to another of it. The green is the area that Chinggis Khan captured. The yellow is what his sons captured, Ogadai and his brothers, the Russian principalities, Persia, and China. Okay. The administrative framework that they used to govern this empire drew on Chinese and Muslim models, and they were, as I said, remarkably astute and also very tolerant of their captured people. Chinggis Khan established his capital at Karakoram on the steppes, and as I showed you on that very first map, at Lake Pakal, that's where the capital Karakoram is. He summoned wise men to his court from all sides of the empire. He brought all the learned scholars he could to his court, and he brought Confucian scholars from China and conferred with them about how to rule China effectively. He brought Muslim engineers and drew on their knowledge to build siege machines for war and to improve trade, building on their knowledge of trade. The Taoist scholars from China he consulted on how to live forever. But this didn't work, of course, because as we've seen, he died and his sons inherited it. Nevertheless, he created an administrative framework drawing on the pattern of Chinese and Muslim models, and he built an amazingly eclectic empire, joining together and intermingling all the different cultures in his empire. Okay, and here's the tomb of Timur at Samarkand. Timur was one of these rulers. I think he was the ruler of the Persian Empire. And so this is a Mongol tomb. This is a Buddhist celebration in the Buddhist region, of course, of Central Asia that was incorporated into the Mongol Empire. And here we see a merchant, a Muslim merchant, who's also incorporated into the Mongol Empire. And all these cultures are blending and merging together. Okay, here is the capital. You see that pink area at Lake Baikal, that's the heartland, and that's where his capital of Karakoram is, in that pink region where Lake Baikal is, okay, Central Asia. And here are the different divisions of the Mongol Empire. A script was devised for the Mongol language. They had no written language until they made all of these conquests, and then they learned to write immediately, and they developed a script for their language for record keeping and recording laws. Okay, what do we have? Two. They developed a standard legal code for the whole empire. They wrote it down and they enforced it. So we have a law code over the entire empire, enforced by the central government. They secured the trade routes and for prosperous and wealthy merchants to travel on, and they had wealthy cosmopolitan cities linked together by the trade routes. After Chinggis Khan's death, they're called the Golden Horde, and they attacked Russia and the West. The Russians called them wrongly Tartars, but that is an incorrect name for them. Sometimes they're called Tatars. And the Mongols carried out the only successful winter invasion of Russia. And why did they do that? Because they could invade over the ice. In Russia, Russia is full of swamps, but in the winter they freeze solid, and so the Mongols invaded on the ice with their little ponies. The cities in Russia were razed to the ground. The inhabitants were slaughtered or slaved, and as one Russian commented, no eye remained to weep for the dead. Nevertheless, Novgorod and Kiev, those great Viking cities where the Vikings founded as the original core culture of Russia, they were spared, largely due to the spring thaw and the mud. Okay, the land thawed out around Novgorod and Kiev before the Mongols could destroy it. Later, Kiev was leveled, but Alexander Nevsky surrendered Novgorod and was spared. Okay. The result in Russia was 2.5 centuries of Mongol bondage. And the Russian, what is that?
Your attention, please. Jose Romero, please come to the service desk.
Okay.
Jose Romero.
Lots of unexpected interruptions. All right. So 2.5 centuries, Russia was under Mongol bondage, and it changed. That's the Mongols invading. It changed Russia drastically. The Mongol rule changed Russia drastically. It became an utterly different country. And one of the things that happened to Russia was the Russian princes were vassals to the Mongol lords, and they paid tribute to the Golden Horde. The peasants were now subdued to serfdom to win protection of the local lords. And this is very interesting because the peasants in Russia were not serfs before the Mongol invasion, and it was the Mongols that turned them into serfs. They were free peasants before the Mongol invasion. Okay, let's take a look. Here is a manuscript with Mongol writing on it, and it shows Mongols, the Mongols invading. This is a really find on my part to get this. Okay. Here is Peking, the Tartar city built by the Tartars, built by the Mongols in the north of China, and it is a showcase of what the Mongols could do in building splendid and thriving cities. Okay, again, here is Russia, the area that the Vikings created and turned into a state. This was conquered by the Mongols and ruled for a very long time. Here's a Russian peasant woman, modern of course, and a Russian peasant man, and I think you can see a little bit of the Mongol dress in the modern costume that he has. And here is a wagon, a Russian wagon drawn by horses, modern of course, very influenced by Mongol rule. What do you see here that suggests Mongol rule, Mongol influence? Perhaps those domes, those onion type of domes that are more like Islamic domes than they are like Russian or even Byzantine domes, because of course the original Russian state converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. Okay. From 1240 to 1241, the Mongols tried to invade Western Europe, and they were saved only by the death of Ogadai, because when Ogadai died, the Mongol army collapsed. But in 1253, the Mongols won a great victory over the Seljuk Turks. And you remember who the Seljuk Turks were. They were the nomads who had conquered the Holy Land and that Islamic region about the time of the First Crusade. Okay, so they were other nomads, but they had converted to Islam and they controlled the Holy Land. In 1258, the Mongols destroyed Baghdad. The result was that Islam was terrorized, that it was completely, just completely terrorized by this great Mongol horde sweeping over it. The Abbasid Caliph was murdered in the city of Baghdad, and 800,000 people are said to have been slaughtered. There was a crisis then of faith and confidence within Islam, and the result is that the Muslim culture withdrew within itself, and its phenomenal cultural growth ended. It was almost a turning in on itself of the Muslim culture. In 1260, a small remnant of Islam was saved in Egypt by the Mamluks, who were slave rulers of Egypt, and they defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut and stopped the westward drive of the Mongols. And this is a turning point, so that the Mongols are stopped in their movement toward Europe and into the western region of Eurasia. And here we see a marketplace, again, tying this great empire together. And this is in, see where this is a bazaar in Baghdad. This is still in Baghdad. And here's Baghdad from the south, which has now been conquered by the Mongols, and the walls of Baghdad, which did not keep the Mongols out. Okay, the Mongols. Baghdad as a center of trade and an important part of the Muslim Empire. Here are Turkish houses near the Mosque of Suleiman, again, the Muslim lands that are touched by the Mongols. And here's the interior of this Muslim Turkish architecture. Okay. So turning eastward, since the Muslim drive was stopped to the west, not the Muslim, but the Mongol drive was stopped to the west, it nevertheless throve in China. From 1260 to 1294 is the rule of Kublai Khan, the fabled Mongol ruler of China. And from 1271 to 1368, we call this the reign of the Yuan Dynasty of China. And the Yuan Dynasty is the Mongol dynasty. The Mongols ruled. At this time, laws were promulgated to preserve the distinction between Mongols and Chinese. And there's a different treatment of the Chinese than the diversity and the blending together that we saw with the Muslims and the Russians in the eastern part. But in China, the Mongols kept their identity. They actually passed laws against intermarriage between Chinese and Mongols. They set themselves up as a ruling class that would be distinct from the Chinese that they had conquered. The Chinese were forbidden to learn the Mongol script, and not only was intermarriage forbidden, but even friendships were forbidden between Mongols and Chinese. They set up a whole new social structure with the Mongols on top and a class structure with the Asian, nomadic, and Muslim allies below them as bureaucrats, and beneath those Muslim allies were the North Chinese, and then the ethnic Chinese, and then the minorities. Okay, so we have almost a caste system being set up by the Mongols in China. At the same time, Mongol women retained their rights, and one thing we've seen about China is that women were routinely marginalized in China. Men were very predominant. Chinese women had very few rights, and so the Mongols retained the rights for their women. The women refused the submission and foot binding of Chinese women. Mongol women could hold property and move freely about the city and the countryside without any restrictions on them. And most strikingly, as I said, they could ride in the polo games and they could ride on the hunt in hunting expeditions. Gradually, however, Neo-Confucianism eroded these rights of women, and by the end of the Yuan Dynasty in 1368, the Mongol women had lost these rights. And so that was one of the unfortunate things. Here is one of the gates of Peking, the great Mongol city. And this is at the time, actually, of World War I. These gates were still standing. Here is a Chinese Mandarin and some other Chinese boy, a female attendant, a soldier. Okay. Here are women being punished in China. They're culprits. They've been caught at something, and this is one of the punishments that they're enduring. And here is a Chinese woman with her feet bound, which the Mongols women rejected. They would not allow themselves to be treated in that way. Blending in together with the submission of Chinese women is a submission of Muslim women. And here we see a Muslim woman, again, Muslim women in the Turkic cultures that were conquered also were oppressed. I think we can say oppressed. And the Mongol women retained their freedom, even when mixing with all of these other cultures that oppressed women. Kublai Khan ruled as the Golden Age ruler of the Yuan Dynasty. He's the one who set the patterns for Yuan China that would construct the court that he had. He attracted scholars and artists and artisans and travelers from many lands. People from all lands were at his court: Persians, Turks, and Europeans. Muslims designed his imperial city, and the Muslims created a more efficient tax system. Persian astronomers corrected the Chinese calendar and made accurate maps for the whole empire. Muslim doctors ran the hospitals and imported medical texts. Chinese learning and technology spread through the entire Muslim world. So again, we see this spreading of culture in the Pax Mongolica, Chinese culture from one end to the other, and Muslim culture spread into China. Urban culture continued to flourish, and the Mongols were seduced by it. They liked urban culture. They left behind their nomadic lifestyle and adopted the ways of civilization and the urban culture. The arts, theater, literature, and art enjoyed a great flowering. Okay, and here we see the great mosque at Delhi, which was built at the time of the spread of Mongol culture over North India. A page of a manuscript copy of the Quran. Okay. And here are the arts flourishing in China, dancers and singers at the Chinese opera. Western reactions were, in Europe, which was flourishing at that time, was to send missionaries to the court of Kublai Khan. In 1254, the Pope of Rome sent missionaries to the courts of the Mongol rulers of China. Probably the most famous of the travelers was Marco Polo, who took a 20-year journey to that court. And these are some of the readings that you have in your readings book. You have, let me just write this down, some of these travelers who went. William of Rubric, was one of these travelers who traveled to the Mongolian court, and of course Marco Polo. And Odoric of Pordenone. And these missionaries wrote books about their travels. In the case of William of Rubric and Odoric of Pordenone, they wrote reports to the Pope telling what they found and what their missionary journeys had accomplished. Here's another one, Francesco Peggle Lottie. Now, he was not a missionary, he was a traveler. That should, now I think I can erase that. Can I erase that? Yes. Okay. He wrote a tract on the practice of commerce for merchants traveling to Cathay, and there were other travelers that were actually later, but those are the main ones that came from either Northern Europe, like William of Rubric from Germany, Marco Polo, and Francesco Pegolotti from Italy. Okay, the writings of Marco Polo were a bestseller of the day. Everybody wanted to read about them. It's really interesting that Marco Polo wasn't the first to go. He made a 20-year journey to the court of Kublai Khan and came back around Southeast Asia. He went in the footsteps of his uncle. His whole family went to China, and his uncle had been there before him, and so he followed him there. But his uncle is not famous, and Marco is. Why do you think that's true? Why is Marco famous and his uncle isn't? He wrote a book about it. Yeah, he wrote a book about it, a bestseller that was a bestseller all over Europe. He did that because he came back, and let me skip to the map for a minute. Here is a picture of Marco Polo, a drawing of him. And here are his travels. If you look at the pink lines in the north, this is William of Rubric in the north, and there's another missionary who also went at the same time. And can you see Lake Baikal there? And they go to the capital of the Mongol Empire there in the north. The yellow line setting out, it actually isn't going from Italy. I should have made it coming from Italy, but it goes from Italy and then across Asia Minor and all the way overland across the area that is now the Silk Road, across the Great Khanate and all the way to China, okay? And then if you can see, the yellow line continues around China and down to the south and around Southeast Asia by sea, around India, across the Bay of Bengal, across the Arabian Sea, and back overland up to Italy. And the main reason we know about Marco Polo is when he got back to Italy, he was thrown in jail and he didn't have anything else to do, so he wrote a book about his travels and described China and everything that he had seen there. So that's the origin of Marco Polo's travels. And let's go back. Let's go back here. What these books did was to whet the appetite of Europeans for travel and discovery. They were very eager to hear about the outside world and what was going on there. There was another legend of another traveler called Prester John. Supposedly he was a Christian who had set up a Christian kingdom, and some people said it was in Africa, some people said it was in Asia, a Christian kingdom in another exotic place. And again, this also was a bestseller of the time. People wanted to hear about exotic places and exotic people. A third novel was The Travels of John Mandeville. Prester John and John Mandeville were fictional characters, but they're books that made people really curious about the outside world and what was going on outside of Europe. Again, when we talked about the Crusades breaking the geographical boundaries of Europe, the connections on the trade routes of the Mongol Empire also began to break through the boundaries of Europe, and this would lead to the Age of Discovery, which is where we're going to end this course when we look at what happened to Europeans. Here's Marco Polo again, and here are the routes that he traveled across the Mongol Empire. William of Rubric was one of the missionaries who went across the northern area of Europe and Central Asia. They were Dominican and Franciscan friars who largely did all of this exploring. This is a Dominican friar, and here is a Franciscan friar. The Dominicans and the Franciscans were very active in the Age of Discovery of Europe, accompanying many of the discoverers. But in 1347 to 1350, there was a huge break in the connection of the whole Eurasian world, and this was the Black Death. A great catastrophe struck Europe. It probably struck Asia as well. Possibly it was facilitated by the Mongol Empire, and Europeans who recorded it thought that it spread along the Silk Route. We know that it hit Byzantium or Asia Minor, modern Turkey, first, and then it struck Italy around 1347. It's said to have been caused by black rats, had been spread by black rats who had a particular kind of flea, who had a particular kind of bacteria that they carried within themselves when they bit people. That was the older explanation of the cause of the spread of the Black Death. That has the newest research has called that into question, and I think the upshot is we're not exactly sure what the disease was, but it was a disease. It was borne by bacteria. It was also airborne and spread by sneezing, and so there may have been two different kinds of diseases that were being spread at the same time. Whatever it was that struck Europe, it came along the trade routes, It then spread throughout Europe, starting in Italy and spreading northward, and 1/3 to 1/2 of the population was affected. More people died in the cities because they lived in close proximity to each other, and more people became infected in the cities. Bodies were stacked up in the streets. The doctors and the priests who cared for the sick and the dead also died, and so a whole layer of society, the very conscientious priests and monks who took care of people, tended to be wiped out. Every medieval institution was affected. The economy was turned upside down because so many people died. More people died in the cities than in the countryside, as I said. The economy was completely turned upside down. The society was changed. There was a labor shortage. Peasants tended to win more rights because their labor was in demand. Politically, at least in England, the government became more oppressive. Laws were passed to control wages and prices because, of course, the wages and prices were skyrocketing because nobody was growing crops in the field, and so food was very expensive. Nobody could carry it into the cities. People were starving from lack of food in the cities. The most conscientious leaders of the church tended to die because they took care of the sick and leaving opportunistic, uneducated people to fill their places. And so the church was really thrown for a loop because of this. The Black Death was an enormous catastrophe for Europe, and the expansion of Europe stopped for a century. But this too set the stage for the Age of Discovery. Okay. When the Yuan Dynasty, the Mongol dynasty, died out in China, a new dynasty arose to power, and this was the Ming Dynasty under Hung Wu. He was a Buddhist monk who led the new dynasty and led the return to pre-Mongol models, and again, they took up the practices of Song China. Once China was free of the Mongol domination, it tended to return to that core Chinese culture with a vengeance and blocked all foreign influences, turning to the China of the core family, Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, and the traditional culture of China. China, too, turned in on itself, closed in on itself, blocking all foreign influences. In 1405 to 1433, we have the last great Chinese naval expeditions. These were led by the Admiral Cheng Ho, who left China and went south, to the south and to the west. He went to Sumatra and India and Persia, Aden in Arabia and Africa, returned to tell about all the great foreign wonders he had seen, bringing exotic animals and plants and products. And when he came home to China, they were not interested. They turned their back on the outside world. They focused on China as the center of the world, and thereafter foreign exploration from China stopped, and China focused inward on itself. Here are the Chinese junks that would have made that great journey to the south. And here is the route of Admiral Cheng Ho. It's this blue line, as you can see, from Canton going through the Straits of Malacca, through around Malaysia, across the Bay of Bengal, and around India, to Aden, and all the way to Africa. Okay, he returned along the same route, and that was the last great exploration that the Chinese did. Okay. Now, in 1400, as the Mongol Empire broke up, a new wave of Ottoman Turks, a new wave of Turks spread to the west. These are the Ottoman Turks, who then took over the remnants of the Mongol Empire and the Seljuk Empire of the Turks in the Holy Land and Asia Minor. And what they did was cut off the Silk Road trade around 1400. Here is Mohammed II, one of these leaders of the Ottoman Turks. They conquered Constantinople, which had stood as a I should have had a map here. I'm sorry, I don't have a map. Constantinople had stood off the assaults of the Muslims for centuries and centuries, and the Ottoman Turks were able to take it. Actually, in 1453 is when Constantinople fell. The only reason it fell was because the Ottomans had cannons and gunpowder so that they could actually shoot down the walls of Constantinople. But we'll return to that and talk about that a little bit more later. Russia was reformulated as the Mongol Empire crumbled and receded from Russia. Russia had to pull itself together in a totally new organization. And here you can see it grows from that purple center. The Principality of Moscow is the center there that pulled together all the leaders of Russia, formulating a new state, and later it expanded by 1462. The pink part is the expansion of Russia, having to build a new state. It's smaller than the old Russia was, as you can see, pulling it together and reformulating. Russia had been vastly changed and orientalized by Mongol occupation. It's still very different from Europe. We still look at Russia today and we think of it as far more autocratic than Europe is. And part of this is from its Mongol heritage, and it's just a different mentality than in the other European states of Europe in Russia. So the Mongol Empire, which unified the whole Eurasian continent and unified it with Africa for a very long time, had a huge impact on the civilizations of Europe and Asia, unifying that world for a while and then crumbling, and connecting East and West with a great interchange of culture. Okay. Now we're going to look at yet another impact of the Mongol, the Mongol people, and that will be the settlement of Japan. They also were impacted by the Mongols, but we have to look at them as a completely separate growth of culture. We'll do that in the second half. Now we have a few minutes for questions or comments, if anybody has a question or comment about the Mongols. No, you all want to go out and get a drink of water. Yeah, question there.
When is our final paper due? Is it due on the final exam?
Do you remember, Maria, when the last night of class, which will be 2 weeks from tonight? Okay, we have 2 more lectures, so your final paper is due 2 weeks from tonight. Good question. Any more questions? Any questions on the final paper or the final exam? Well, we have extra time. No, you all feel good about your paper? You all feel good about your final exam? You will have 3 hours for the final exam. Some of you complained that you had only 2 for the midterm. It's designed to be a 2-hour exam, but we'll give you the extra hour if you want to take it. Okay. Yeah, question?
Will it be the same format as the midterm?
Yes, it'll be exactly the same format as the midterm. There'll be an essay question, and we'll give you 10 study questions. We need to post those pretty soon, too. We'll have 10 study questions, and we will choose 3 of those questions, and you will write on 1 of those questions, and that will count for half your grade on the exam. Then you will have a map with 10 locations, and you need to write a short essay on, well, it'll have 12 locations, and you write a short essay on 10 of those locations, telling the significance of that location. And then the last one will be a mystery source, which will be a source from one of the cultures we looked at in the last half of the class. And it can be any of them we looked at, and your essay should describe the clues within that source that lead you to identify what it is. Question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I missed the first part of what you said there, the first part of the exam. Is it going to be like what it was on the midterm?
Yeah.
Okay.
It'll be just like the midterm. The essay, the big essay, will be over the entire class. Okay, the entire class. The map questions will be only that last half of the class, and the primary and the mystery source will be only the last half of the class. Okay. Oh, it's that time coming up again. Okay. Okay, well, we could stop a little bit early, and we'll take about a 15-minute break, and when we come back, we'll look at Japan.